It was supposed to be a quick detour. I'd been driving all night to reach my sister's house for her wedding, and the GPS rerouted me to avoid traffic. I didn't think twice, just followed the blinking arrow off the highway and onto a narrow road surrounded by thick woods. The road seemed fine at first, a typical back road, but as I drove, it got narrower, the pavement crumbling until it was barely wide enough for my car. Branches scraped the sides, clawing at the paint, and soon the GPS lost its signal altogether. I tried to turn around, but the road was too narrow, boxed in by dense trees on either side. I had no choice but to keep moving forward, the unsettling feeling growing with each passing minute. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches hanging lower, almost as if they were reaching for me. My headlights illuminated the path ahead, but the road was becoming more like a trail, rough and unpredictable. The deeper I drove, the more I felt like I was venturing into a place that didn't want me there. That's when I saw it, a rusted car, abandoned in the middle of the road. My headlights caught it at the last second, and I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding to a stop. The car was covered in vines, the windows shattered like it had been there for years. I honked, hoping someone might hear me, but the forest swallowed the sound. There was no one around, just me and that silent, rusting heap of metal. The night seemed to grow darker, the air colder. The thought crossed my mind that maybe I wasn't alone, that maybe someone or something was out there, hidden in the shadows, watching me. I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping dread, but it clung to me. I decided to back out, to get away from that car and this road, but as soon as I put the car in reverse, I heard a loud thud. My heart sank. I got out to check and found a plank of wood covered in nails lodged into my back tires. The nails had shredded the rubber, leaving me stranded. I kicked the plank in frustration, the echo of my footstep bouncing off the trees. I was stuck. I looked up, scanning the woods around me. The thick underbrush seemed to shift in the darkness, and every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. Panic began to gnaw at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no accident. Someone had put that plank there on purpose. Looking around, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Faint footprints leading from the abandoned car into the woods. They were barely visible in the dim light, but they were there, pressed into the dirt, leading away into the darkness. My breathing grew shallow as I took a step closer to get a better look. The prints were small, like they belonged to a child, and they vanished into the thick underbrush. I felt a chill run down my spine, my instincts screaming at me to get back in the car. I rushed back, slamming the door behind me, and locked it, grabbing my phone, but there was no signal. The screen showed only a useless no service, and my hands shook as I tried to think of what to do next. Every option felt impossible, and the walls of the car seemed to be closing in on me. The silence was broken by a rustling sound, just outside the car. I turned, my eyes wide, scanning the tree line. A shadow moved, slipping between the trees. I could barely make it out, but it was there, creeping closer. My breath caught in my throat as I heard it, a faint knock on the passenger window. My heart pounded as whispers followed, too soft to understand but unmistakably real. Someone was out there, just beyond the glass. I stared at the window, my pulse racing, the darkness beyond making it impossible to see who or what was out there. The whispers grew louder, an eerie chorus that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I reached over and turned off the headlights, plunging the car into darkness, hoping that whoever was out there would lose interest. Panic took over. I grabbed my keys and bolted from the car, running down the road, my feet pounding against the cracked pavement. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away from there. Branches tore at my clothes as I ran, my breath ragged, my chest tight with fear. The road felt endless, stretching out before me with no sign of civilization. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A house, just barely visible through the trees, its silhouette dark against the night sky. Relief surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, my legs burning as I closed the distance. I sprinted toward it, hoping for help, for safety, anything. But when I reached it, I realized something was horribly wrong. The yard was filled with rusted, stripped cars, their frames twisted and broken. like they'd been there for decades. The sight of them made my stomach drop, a sense of dread washing over me. The windows of the house were shattered, the door hanging open. There were no lights, no signs of life, just an empty shell filled with decay. The air around the house was thick with the smell of rust and mold, and every instinct told me to turn back, to leave before it was too late. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight, and peered inside. The darkness was thick, impenetrable, and I could just barely make out the outline of old, broken furniture scattered across the floor. My wrong turn wasn't an accident. The traps on the road, the rusted cars, the abandoned house, it was all deliberate. Someone had set this up, lured me here, and now I was caught in their snare. I turned back, my heart racing, but my car was gone. The spot where it had been now empty, swallowed by the darkness. My knees nearly buckled as panic set in. I was alone, stranded, with nothing but the woods around me and the creeping sense that I was being watched. Somewhere behind me, a twig snapped, and I knew whoever had set the traps was still out there, and they were coming for me. I was on foot, lost, and all I could do was run. The dark woods closing in around me, every shadow a potential threat, every sound echoing my fear. My detour had led me down a road to nowhere, and now I was paying the price, left to wander the woods, knowing that someone was out there, following me, waiting for their moment to strike. The further I ran, the more disoriented I became. The woods a maze of identical trees and twisted paths. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. I could hear them behind me now, footsteps, slow and deliberate, like they knew I had nowhere to go. The darkness pressed in, and with every step, I felt the gap between me and my pursuer closing. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the trees. My vision blurred, tears streaming down my face as I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely able to keep my footing. I could see nothing but darkness ahead, and I knew I was running blindly. Then, just for a moment, I thought I saw a light, a flicker in the distance. Hope surged through me and I changed direction, sprinting toward it, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a light, it was another trap, a lantern hung from a tree branch, swaying gently in the breeze. A warning or maybe a lure, just like the road that had led me here. I fell to my knees, exhaustion overtaking me, the realization sinking in that there was no way out. The footsteps grew closer, the whispers now a steady murmur that surrounded me. I had walked right into their trap, and now there was nothing left to do but wait. My detour had become my nightmare, the road to nowhere now a prison, and I could feel them closing in, their presence a shadow that would never let me go. Story 2. I was 18, fresh out of high school, and on a road trip with my best friends Max and Jamie. We were headed to a music festival, laughing and blasting music, when Max insisted we take a shortcut he found on his phone. "It'll save us an hour," he said, famous last words. The road started off fine, just a narrow 2-lane strip cutting through the countryside. The landscape was open and inviting, fields of green stretching out on either side of us, the occasional farmhouse dotting the horizon. But soon, the pavement turned to gravel, and then to dirt. The trees grew thicker, crowding in on either side, and the sunlight seemed to fade, leaving everything cloaked in an eerie twilight. Jamie, sitting in the back, started to get nervous. "Are you sure this is right?" she asked, her voice tight. Max, ever the optimist, just laughed. "Trust me," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The cheerful, carefree mood that had been with us all day seemed to evaporate as we drove further. Still, we kept going, the car bouncing over the uneven ground, dust kicking up behind us. The music turned down now, as if the road itself demanded silence. We hit a fork in the road, and Max paused, staring at his phone. There was no signal, just a frozen map that wasn't much help. He chose left, and we went deeper into nowhere. The dirt path narrowed, and I started to feel uneasy. The road twisted and turned, the trees so thick they blocked out the sky. The laughter that had filled the car earlier had died away, replaced by a tense silence. I glanced at Jamie in the rearview mirror, her eyes wide, her fingers clutching the seat. She wasn't saying anything now, but I could tell she wanted to turn back. We drove on, and that's when we saw it. A burned-out RV, sitting lopsided on the side of the road. Graffiti covered its sides, and the windows were broken, shards of glass scattered across the dirt. The sight of it made my stomach twist. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten and decaying. The metal was rusted, the roof partially caved in, the graffiti barely legible beneath layers of grime and age. Jamie swore she saw someone watching us from the trees, just a shadowy figure lurking at the edge of the forest. I brushed it off, telling her it was just her imagination, but the truth was, I felt it too. The sense that we were being watched, that we had stumbled somewhere we shouldn't be. The car lurched as we hit a patch of mud, the tires spinning uselessly. Max cursed, and we all climbed out, the mud sucking at our shoes as we tried to push the car free. The air was thick, and the woods around us were eerily silent, like even the animals knew better than to make a sound. Then, from somewhere close by, we heard it, the snap of a branch, followed by footsteps. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked at Max, his face pale. Jamie was already back in the car, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. With a final heave, we got the car free, the tires finding traction. We scrambled back inside, slamming the doors, and Max floored it. The car fishtailed, mud spraying, but we were moving. Just as we started to pick up speed, headlights appeared behind us. Bright, blinding lights, closing in fast. My pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. Whoever was behind us wasn't just following, they were chasing us. The headlights swerved left and right, and I could hear the roar of an engine, the sound of it growing louder, closer. Max pushed the car as fast as it would go, the tires skimming over the dirt, the road a blur of shadows and light. But the car behind us was faster, relentless. It rammed into us, the force sending us skidding off the road and into a ditch. The impact knocked the wind out of me, my head slamming into the window. For a moment, everything was a blur, my vision swimming. I heard Jamie scream, the sound piercing through the ringing in my ears. Before I could react, the doors were yanked open, hands grabbing me, pulling me out of the car. I hit the ground hard, the taste of blood in my mouth. Max was struggling, shouting, but there were too many of them. Men in dark clothes, their faces obscured, guns glinting in the dim light. They dragged us away from the car, their grips like iron. Jamie was sobbing, her eyes wide with terror. I tried to fight, to break free, but a fist connected with my stomach, the pain doubling me over, leaving me gasping for breath. They weren't random locals. The way they moved, the way they spoke to each other, it was organized, methodical. They were part of something, an operation hiding deep in the woods, and we had stumbled right into their territory. I caught glimpses of things as they pulled us along, a clearing filled with equipment, tarps covering something I couldn't see, the smell of gasoline heavy in the air. My mind raced trying to piece it together, but nothing made sense. All I knew was that we were in serious trouble, and there was no way out. They dragged us into a large makeshift camp, lit by floodlights. The place was surrounded by tall, barbed wire fences, and there were more men milling about, all armed, all wearing the same dark clothes. They herded us into a small shack at the edge of the clearing, the inside cramped and reeking of oil and sweat. They tied us to chairs, the rope digging into my wrists, and I exchanged a terrified glance with Jamie. Max was breathing heavily, his face set in a grimace of pain and fear. One of the men, taller than the others with a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward. He eyed us, his gaze cold and calculating. "You three made a mistake coming here," he said, his voice a low growl. He paced back and forth, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He looked at Max, then Jamie, and finally me. "This is restricted territory. You've seen things you shouldn't have seen." Jamie whimpered, tears streaming down her face. Max opened his mouth, but no words came out. I could barely breathe, my mind racing with fear. The scarred man leaned down, his face inches from mine. "You're lucky we don't shoot you right now," he said, his voice a hiss. "But we've got other plans for you." Hours later, maybe more, time had lost all meaning. They let us go. They blindfolded us, drove us miles from wherever we had been, and dumped us on the side of an empty road. My legs were shaky, my body aching from the bruises. Max was quiet, his face blank, and Jamie just stared at the ground, her eyes hollow. They hadn't killed us, but they'd made it clear that we had seen too much, that we were lucky to be alive. Our car was gone, taken or destroyed, and we were left with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the knowledge that we'd barely escaped with our lives. We walked for what felt like hours, the silence between us heavy. There were no jokes, no laughter, just the sound of our footsteps on the gravel, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, the festival, the music. All of it felt like a lifetime ago. We had taken a wrong turn, and it had led us somewhere dark, somewhere we never should have been. The road stretched out ahead of us, an endless path leading nowhere, the early morning mist clinging to the trees. By the time we found help, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the empty road. We were miles from anywhere, carless and scarred, knowing we had gotten lucky to even survive. And as we sat there, waiting for someone to come by, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever truly be able to leave that place behind, or if a part of us would always be stuck on that dead-end road, waiting for the headlights to appear once more. Eventually, a beat-up pickup truck rumbled down the road, an old man behind the wheel. He pulled over, eyeing us with suspicion as he rolled down the window. "What happened to you kids?" he asked, his voice gruff. Max looked at him, his expression hollow. "We got lost," he said simply. The old man shook his head, muttering something under his breath before nodding for us to get in the back. We climbed in, the metal bed cold against our bruised bodies. The truck rattled as it moved, and I stared at the road behind us, watching it disappear in the distance, the dark woods swallowing everything whole. We didn't talk on the ride into town. There was nothing left to say. When we finally reached a gas station, the old man dropped us off, giving us a final wary glance before driving away. We stumbled inside, the bright lights stinging our eyes. The clerk looked up, startled, and Jamie broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Max wrapped an arm around her, his own eyes glistening with tears. I stood there, numb, staring at the reflection of us in the window. 3 kids who had seen something they shouldn't have, who had come face to face with something dark and terrible. The police came eventually, and we told them what we could. They listened, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes. They nodded, took notes, but it was clear they didn't believe us. Who would? It sounded like a nightmare, something pulled from a horror movie. They promised to look into it, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever we had stumbled upon, those men had covered their tracks well. We were given a ride back home, our parents crying, hugging us, asking questions we couldn't answer. The days blurred together after that. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the headlights, felt the cold grip of fear as they closed in on us. Jamie stopped talking altogether, and Max just stared at the wall, his face empty. We had gotten lucky, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like we had left a part of ourselves back there, on that road, lost forever in the dark. And sometimes late at night, I'd find myself standing at my window, staring out at the empty street, waiting for the roar of an engine, the flash of headlights, waiting for the past to catch up with me, to drag me back to that place where the woods were thick and the road led nowhere. And I knew, deep down, that some things you never truly escape. Story 3. We were 2 hours from Phoenix when the storm hit, a freak dust storm that swallowed the highway in seconds. My girlfriend Emily was panicking, her hands gripping the dashboard, eyes wide as the sky turned brown and the wind howled. I made the mistake of pulling off to wait it out, thinking we'd be safer off the main road. That's when I saw the dirt road, barely visible through the haze, and thought it might lead us somewhere safer, somewhere out of the storm's direct path. The dirt road stretched for miles, the storm slowly beginning to clear. The swirling dust thinned out, and soon we could see again, but there was nothing. No signs, no landmarks, just an endless track winding through a flat, barren landscape. Emily was biting her lip, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Are we lost?" she asked, her voice shaking. I forced a smile. "We'll find our way back," I assured her, but my own nerves were starting to fray. The road just kept going, taking us further away from where we'd come. After what felt like an eternity, Emily pointed. "Look," she said, her voice filled with hope. In the distance, there was a structure, a gas station maybe, or something like it. I turned towards it, relief washing over me. But as we got closer, that hope evaporated. It wasn't a gas station. It was just an old boarded-up shack, the wood weathered and gray, the windows shattered. There was no sign of life, just a husk left to rot under the desert sun. Emily's shoulders sagged, and I could feel the weight of disappointment settle over both of us. The car's engine began to sputter. I cursed under my breath, glancing at the dashboard. The gas gauge was low, dangerously close to empty. I pressed the gas pedal, but the engine coughed, shuddered, and then died. We were completely off course, stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service, and the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon. I banged my fist on the steering wheel, frustration bubbling over. Emily looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do now?" she whispered. With no other option, we decided to walk back to the main road. We packed a small bag with water and some snacks and set off, the sun casting long shadows across the desert floor. The terrain was rough, the ground cracked and uneven, making every step a struggle. The wind had calmed, but there was something else now, a strange noise, faint and distant, like whispers carried on the wind. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded, trying to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. The whispers seemed to follow us, growing louder, then fading, like something was toying with us. As we trudged onward, we came across an abandoned van, its windows shattered, doors hanging open. The paint was faded, and there were deep scratches along the sides, as if something had tried to tear it apart. Inside, we found bloodstains, dark and dried, smeared across the seats. Emily let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. On the floor, there was a torn map, the edges frayed. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was old, the paper brittle, but there were markings on it, a path leading deeper into the desert, with a red X scrawled at the end. Emily wanted to turn back. She grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We shouldn't be here," she said, her voice cracking. But something about that map drew me in, a morbid curiosity that I couldn't shake. "What if there's help out there?" I argued, though even as I said it, I knew it sounded ridiculous. Still, I pushed forward, and reluctantly, Emily followed. The path marked on the map led us further into the desert, the landscape growing more desolate with each step. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they were getting louder, more insistent. The sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature plummeted, the chill biting into our skin. We stumbled on, guided only by the fading light of dusk and the haunting whispers that seemed to echo all around us. We came across a clearing, and that's when we saw them. Mounds of freshly turned earth, a makeshift graveyard hidden in the desert. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. Emily tugged at my sleeve, her voice breaking. "We need to go now." But I couldn't move, my eyes fixed on the rows of shallow graves, the dirt still loose. I stepped closer, my foot hitting something solid. I knelt down, brushing the dirt aside, revealing a half-buried cross, crudely fashioned from two pieces of wood tied together. My stomach churned, a sense of dread washing over me. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had made this place. Someone had been here recently. Suddenly, Emily screamed. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. In the fading light, I saw them, figures standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us. They were still, their faces obscured by shadows, but I could feel their eyes on us, could sense the malice. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and I realized they weren't just the wind. They were warnings, voices trying to tell us to leave, to run. I grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her away, my heart pounding. We ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, the figures moving closer, their footsteps barely making a sound. The desert seemed to stretch on forever, an endless expanse of darkness and fear. My legs burned, every muscle screaming for me to stop, but I couldn't. Not with them behind us, not with the whispers urging us to flee. Eventually, we found a road. It was just a strip of cracked asphalt, barely visible in the moonlight, but it was something. We collapsed onto it, gasping for breath, our mouths dry, our bodies trembling. The desert was silent now, the whispers gone, but I could still feel them, could still hear their warnings echoing in my mind. Emily was crying, her tears leaving streaks down her dust-covered face. I pulled her close, my own eyes stinging. We were alive, but I knew we'd never forget what we had seen, what we had felt out there. By the time a car finally appeared, its headlights cutting through the darkness, we were dehydrated, exhausted, and terrified. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, rolled down his window, his eyes widening at the sight of us. "What happened to you two?" he asked, but I couldn't find the words to answer. He led us into the back seat, handed us bottles of water, and drove us towards civilization. Emily clung to me, her body shaking, and I stared out the window, watching the desert fade into the distance, the memories of what had happened refusing to let go. We made it back, but something had changed. The desert had taken a part of us, left us scarred in a way that couldn't be seen, but was deeply felt. We didn't talk about what happened, not to each other, not to anyone. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the graves, the figures in the dark, and I heard the whispers, a constant reminder that we had walked into a place we never should have found, and somehow we had made it out. Not everyone had been so lucky.